Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen just fine. And thank you all for joining. My name is Lee Burton, and I'm the owner of naturaliststudies.com. So if you haven't seen a website already, you can see the kind of courses that we have to offer on there. Um, I'm also online. We have a YouTube account, as well as social media, and actually just opened up a new one called Outside Professor. So you can check that out. Just one note on that, there's an S missing. Twitter has a length limit on their handle, so it's professor with just one S. I'm also an adjunct instructor, so I teach courses at several universities, at the University of Florida, at Texas A&M, and the University of Idaho. And this is in several subjects to do with animal behavior. One of them is wildlife tracks and signs, which we're going to talk about this evening. And then I'm a little bit of background and how I got into this. So I'm certified in track and sign. There's an organization called Cyber Tracker Conservation. They started actually in Africa. It's a long story behind that. It's very interesting in terms of actually training indigenous people who had kind of lost these skills, had them in order to help do census counts for animals as part of conservation projects. And that was brought over here to the U.S. A gentleman by the name of Mark Elbrock took that on, and they started over here. He actually has a wonderful book as well called Mammal Tracks and Signs of North America. I highly recommend it. I think it's the best tracking book out there by far. Very comprehensive. Anyway, they run certification exams, great learning environment. So usually 2 days. And so years ago, I started that process. So I got certified by them. I'm also, it's called a bird language leaders instructor. If you've ever heard anything of what bird language is, it's another course I teach, and I studied under John Young. And then I'm trained in other skills too, like wilderness survival, foraging, and things that are generally referred to as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And then I'm also a master naturalist. So I'm interested in both kind of the scientific aspect, but also much more the nature connection, the hands-on aspect of these skills, because I think that's not only what really takes you to the next level in understanding whether you're a career biologist or you're just interested in nature, but it also adds to your enjoyment, and you get so much more of your time outside. So I think this is a discipline that really is anyone can participate in. So if you enjoy what you hear tonight, and you have friends and family, this is something great activity to do, basically with anyone. Okay, so let's jump right in on, we're going to talk about canine tracks and their characteristics and what you look for and how to identify particular species of canine tracks. So the first thing when we discuss canine tracks and their features is that we want to remember that the front tracks are bigger than the hinds. And that's almost always the case, and particularly when we're talking about width. So you can see in this track here, if I were to take a ruler, it's close, but it's actually going to be slightly wider, certainly wider than the hind track's going to be. Probably the length and the width are roughly close to each other. A really big track, like a wolf track, it may actually be wider than longer, but they're definitely wider than the hind tracks. And both sets of tracks, fronts and hinds, are what we refer to as, generally speaking, symmetrical. So if I drew a line right down the middle of this track between the two toes and the palm pad, the left and right would mostly match up. Now, it may not be exactly, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but for the most part, it's symmetrical. And that depends on some other things too, on substrate. If an animal was leaning one way or the other, some toes may splay, but for the most part, you're going to find them that they're symmetrical. And you're also going to see that all four toes register on both the front and the hind. So there's other species where that's not the case. They do have a dew claw, which rarely, if ever, registers in canines. And you'll see that the toes are, generally speaking, either oval or rounded shape. Okay, so we'll see that in a couple different species. And if I drew a line across the top of this track right here, you'll see that it angles, and that angle points up and to the inside or the midline of the animal. Okay, so that tells me, and again, it depends on the registration of the track, but that tells me whether it's going to be a left or a right, typically speaking. So the high toe, an easier way to think about that is the high toe is going to be on the inside. And then you can also see, in addition, that's the blue line, but also in canine tracks, they have this negative space. And if you draw a line between the toes, let's say the outer toes on one side, and then between the inner toe and the palm pad on the other, and then you do the same thing from the inner toes to the outer toe and the palm pad, you get typically what's an X or an H shape, I guess a distorted H, so to speak. So if you look here in the yellow, you can see that that's very clean. And that's really unique to canine tracks. Some other features is that nails usually register in most species. There's one exception to that, which we're going to talk about. And also the metacarpal pads are fused together. So you can see this right here, that there's one large palm pad. It's actually made up of separate pads though, but you can't tell that from the track. They're actually fused together. And if you took all of the toes from this track, so it's got 4 toes here, they wouldn't quite fit inside the pad. In other words, the area of the toes are too much to, if you tried to squeeze them all into the pad, they wouldn't fit. And that's different from felines, okay, which is the opposite of that. The preferred gaits, which is a very important aspect of tracking, that's outside tonight's discussion. But for canines, it's typically trots, which is very common for species like coyotes. And when they're moving slower, an overstep walk, which is when the hind leg lands in front of where the front foot landed. And in terms of finding canines, trails, and again, we're talking about wild canines. In this case, dogs are different, but typically you'll find their trails crossing open land, open pasture a lot of time. Okay, getting from point A to point B, it's very common to find their trails there. So let's look at some of the most common canine tracks that we have here in North America, and we'll start with the coyote track. And there's 2 examples on the right here. The top one is a front, the lower one is a hind. And coyote tracks, the first thing which draws my attention to them and kind of alerts me, you know, in terms of obviously distinguishing between canines, is the fact that they are a tight, or what's often referred to as a compressed track. And what we mean by that, if you look at these toes over here, they're very close together. You can see these 2 inner toes almost touch, very tightly next to it, tucked just underneath are the outer toes. We can see this clear X in the negative space. And again, that's the space where nothing's registering, okay, on the animal's foot. We can see that right here. And then these outer toes are very close, almost again touching the palm pad. So it's a very tight track. And then also very common with coyotes, and this photo doesn't show it quite as well as some other ones, but the nails are usually thin and very sharp, and particularly the outer nails are very close to the inner toes above them. Sometimes they're just very little wispy marks. It's easy to miss that. Also, too, the toenails on the inner toes like this often kind of point towards each other, and if you extended them would come almost to a point up here. And that's something that's I think almost unique to coyotes. And in some cases their nails are so sharp because they're always using them. They're not like domestic dogs where they're barely registered. It's hard to see them. Again, so that's what I just spoke about. The outside nails are very close to what are called the inner toes, which are 3 and 4. Okay. And the toes are oval shaped in coyotes. Okay, so not as much round, and you can see this here. Those are clearly oval shaped. Excuse me. The outside one, sometimes in deeper substrate, will be almost a little bit triangle, but still tucked in very tightly. And you can see the same thing in the hind track below here. Again, the negative space is an X, which you can see here, as I spoke about earlier. And the hind track is absolutely narrower, okay, and smaller overall than the front track. Okay, now these were taken in different areas. And this hind track is probably proportionally a little bigger than it would be if it was from the same set of tracks as this one. But you can tell even here that it's a smaller track. And the palm pad in the hind sometimes makes a very small registration. You can barely see it. And there are definitely times when coyotes can be very hard to tell from domestic dogs, okay? A lot of times domestic dog tracks are not as neat and tight, and so it's easy to tell, but sometimes it can be very difficult. And their preferred gait, again, as we mentioned earlier, is a trot or an overstep walk. Okay, let's look at domestic dogs. So if we compare domestic dogs to coyotes, we'll see, first of all, that they have these very large blunt toenails, and you can clearly see that here. They're very rounded, and this is a function of they don't dig very often, so they're not going to be as sharp as coyotes. And what's often termed is they have kind of fatter, lazier toes. And if you just look at the general shape of this track compared to the coyote track, you can see it's more splayed, and it's just not as neat, compressed, or as tight, okay? And that's what's referred to as kind of a lazy track. And particularly in the hind track, a lot of times, it's a little bit bigger than you would find in wild canine species. Again, these outer toes, which are toes 2 and 5, if we looking at anatomy, that's what they're referred to. The inner toes are 3 and 4. They're not tucked as tightly underneath the inner toes. They're still under them, but again, just not as squeezed in. We do get the same X shape, or maybe a little bit of an H here in this one. Definitely more of an X in the hind track below here. And there's less distinction or differentiation between the front tracks in dogs and in wild canines. So a lot of times the hind track almost always is smaller, but not as much of a difference as in wild canine tracks. One of the problems with dogs, and why you have some of them that do look like wild canines, particularly coyotes, is that there's so many varieties of domestic dogs that their tracks vary quite a bit. And so that can make it challenging sometimes. But again, generally these features I just spoke about will be true. And their preferred gait is the same, a trot and an overstep walk. So if we look at a wolf track here, it's the largest of the canine tracks. If you've ever seen a wolf, either out in the wild, up close, if you've been lucky enough, or, in a zoo setting, they're very large canines, okay? And so their track, because they have to carry more weight, particularly on the front track, it's going to be wider than coyote track. Okay? It's just a meatier track. It's still tight. They're not lazy compared to domestic dogs. And you see these toes are pretty tightly tucked in there, but it's going to be a wider track. And again, the nails are going to be more blunt, and that's probably because wolves spend as much time, digging and scraping and looking for smaller food. So they typically register more reliably, and they're easier to see, and you can see that in both of these pictures here. The toes also are going to be more rounded. So if we look at that coyote track again, you'll see there's a little bit of oval shape to this wolf track, but overall they're much more round, and particularly in this hind track here than you would see in the coyote track. Okay. Also, we have more, particularly in the front track, of an H shape. So the diagram I showed you initially was a wolf track, and you can see here in this negative space where nothing registered from the animal on the ground, it makes more of an H shape than it does an X. And in the hind, though, you can see it's a clear X shape. I can draw right through here. So that's a great way to identify canines. Again, the hind track's going to be smaller and narrower, and the palm pad, you can see here, this didn't register really cleanly, this front track, but that's a huge palm pad. And that's actually a pretty large palm pad in the hind track down here, but not nearly as much as in the front track. Sometimes wolves, again, compared to their domestic cousins, large dogs, can be hard to tell apart. Again, they're not quite as tight as a coyote track. So, and again, in deeper substrate where the toes are going to splay, it can be a little bit tricky. Okay. They can look like dogs, and especially because of the blunt nails. And they have the same gaits, again, trot, overstep, walk, are their main, what we call harmonic gaits. So let's look now at a red fox track. So we're kind of going down in size here. So red fox track has long, thin, and sharp nails, okay? And we can kind of see that here. They don't register as reliably as they do in larger canine species, but they do show up a lot of the time. Lots of negative space between the track. Now this front track here was registered in sand, so it's not as clean to see, but you can still see a lot of negative space here in between the toes and the palm pad. You can see it a little bit here. Again, not a real clean track on this one. Again, it's an X shape, the negative space, both the front and the hind. And one of the reasons that this track doesn't register as cleanly is because red foxes have a lot of fur on the bottom of their feet, not as much as some other fox species, but still quite a bit. And so you don't get as clean definition, I guess I would say, in terms of its overall kind of smoother. And you can actually see that fur registering a lot of times in the substrate. The key thing for red fox tracks on the front track is that you get this chevron mark. So if you look up here, you can see almost a straight line across. And a lot of times that's all you see for the palm pad. Okay, so no other canine species, in fact, no other species, period, that I can think of has this. So if you're in the right ecology or habitat or range, I should say, for red foxes, and you see that and everything else lines up with the canine, it's a good indication it's a red fox. Occasionally, gray foxes will get an imperfect register, but typically, if you see this, it's going to be a red fox. Okay, you don't see that, by the way, in the hind track. In the hind track, you get a little bit of a triangular pad. Okay, and again, it typically will barely register in many cases. And they have the same gait that they use as other canines. Their most common gaits are a trot and an overstep walk. Okay, let's contrast that now with a gray fox track. Okay, this is one of my favorite tracks of any species. I just think it's a beautiful track. It's great when you find them, and it's just a very clean track. And one of the reasons is because they don't have nails that register typically. And the reason for that is that unlike felines who have what are considered retractable claws, in foxes, in gray foxes, they're called protractable or semi-protractable. And this is why actually they're pretty good tree climbers. If you live in an area like I do and you're out looking for wildlife a lot, it's not uncommon to see a gray fox in a tree. Okay, maybe not as good climbers as cats, but it's certainly not unusual. Their palm pads are small, particularly compared to other canines, and the overall track is smaller. And there's a big difference, though, between the pad and the front track, the palm pad, and in the hind track. It's very small in the hind track. One of the other differences is that they have, I think, the most rounded toe of all of the canines, okay? Their toes are more rounded, a little bit in this hind, it shows more oval, but a lot of times they're almost perfectly round, their toes. And they typically have, this one doesn't show as much as its deeper substrate, but a lot of times you'll see very much negative space between the toes and the palm pad. And another key indicator is you'll see these two toes at the top will be very close together, and then you'll see some space where this X in the negative space forms between the palm pad and the other toes. Okay, so that's another good indication to distinguish front track in a gray fox. They're typically smaller. They're almost always going to be smaller than red fox tracks, and unless you don't get a good register, you're not going to see that chevron. Now, I have seen a few where it kind of looks like, but that's only because the palm pad just didn't get a clean register. One of the things that they're confused with very commonly are domestic cats, okay, because the track size is about the same. You don't see nails showing, obviously the same number of toes, so that can be quite confusing. There are some things you can look to differentiate, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Their preferred gait is a little bit different. They do use trots, but rather than an overstep walk, because they have these short hind legs, a lot of times they have what's called a direct register, or even an understep walk, which means that their hinds are not going to step in front of their front feet. That's very unusual. They either step right on top of them or slightly behind them. So it's just another clue to help. If you didn't have, let's say, tracks that were clearly delineated, that would be a clue that might help identify a gray fox. So let's move on now and let's talk about some feline tracks. Okay. I love finding feline tracks and comparing them to canine tracks. There's a lot of similarities, but there's some key differences. Okay. So the first thing is that we want to notice in feline tracks, the front tracks are going to be bigger and rounder than the hind tracks. Okay, and that's true in every kind of feline. And so we'll see that. And there's some other differences in what we call morphology, but it's definitely true. And particularly on the width, you'll just see that a front track is going to be wider than a hind track. Okay. The other thing is that a difference with canines is that the tracks in felines are typically asymmetrical. Okay, so if I drew a line right down the middle of this track and bisected it, and I look at the left and the right, it has a fair amount of asymmetry. Okay, and the main one is that this toe, which is what we call the leading toe, and this is toe 3. Okay, and the reason it's called toe 3 is because the toe that doesn't register anymore, since they only have 4, is called toe 1. And then the inner toe is toe 2. So this is toe 3, 4, and 5. And so that top toe there is toe 3, usually sticks considerably above the next highest toe, which is the inner toe next to it. And so it gives it this sort of asymmetry. And also sometimes the other toes are just not perfectly aligned if you compare them left to right side. Okay, so again, we do have 4 toes, just like canines, in both the front and the hind. One difference, though, between cats, particularly in wild species, is you get this more teardrop shape, versus round or even more oval. So it comes more, tapers more, it comes almost to a point sometimes. And again, that depends on the species. In felines, the toes can flex. And so what happens is that the overall track size can vary a lot. And they do that depending on the substrate. So in deeper substrate, they'll flex, and typically trying to get more surface area to get more traction. So you can get a lot of different size. And that's one of the reasons we don't want to go primarily towards size when we're trying to analyze a track and vary down species. We want to go by morphology. Okay. Again, I mentioned earlier versus canines, felines have retractable claws. Okay. And the nails, again, because of that, rarely register, only typically if they're really trying to dig in to get traction. So you rarely see that. The other key aspect of feline tracks is that rather than this kind of well-defined X, you get more of this C shape. And so if I draw a curve between the palm pad and the toes, I get this kind of arc all the way around. And that's a very reliable indicator of a feline species. Okay, so in terms of their palm pad or metacarpal pad, they have a bunch of different pads which are fused together and forms really what's known as a triangle, a trapezoid shape instead of a triangle. So, and because of that, we get these kind of sometimes almost 2 humps. It may actually be continuous across of here, but then it comes down, and then we have a line across the bottom. And sometimes we get this sort of 3 humps on the bottom. Okay, so 2 on the top, we call these lobes. So sometimes, again, depending on the species, bilobed on the top and almost trilobed on the bottom. You can think of it like an upside down W or maybe an M shape. That's a great feature to look for to identify feline tracks. And another key difference between them and canines is that you can take all of these toes and you can just about fit them inside the palm pad. Okay. You can't do that reliably with canine tracks. Now, this palm pad may look a little bit small here. Okay, if I back up, You can see here, but if I look at the extended part of this pad here, which goes down the bottom, you could see I could pretty much fit all of these toes inside that pad. And that's because the pad is proportionally larger versus the toes in felines than it is compared to canines, okay? Their preferred gait is a walk, so you won't see cats very often, if ever, doing trots. It's just not their main gait, okay? And you'll commonly find their trails on dirt roads or other paths, as well as they love to traverse through canyons and through brush. So around by creeks, a lot of times is a great place to look for them. And if you see the tracks of more than one cat, because they're not really social species, it's likely you found a mom with cubs, okay? And one thing also to note, a difference between canine and feline tracks, by the time that that when you have wolves or coyotes, by the time they're pups, okay, get out of the den, their feet, even though they're not fully grown, if you've ever seen a puppy on a dog, their feet are huge compared to the size of the dog, and they kind of grow into their feet. So with felines, that's not true. As soon as they're up and about, if it's a smaller, it's a cub, they're going to have small feet compared to the adults. So it's very, it's almost never that you find tracks of small wild canines that are much smaller than the adults. They're very close. In felines, though, you will. And if you see that, because they're not social animals, typically, there's some exceptions to that, you usually have a mom with cubs, okay? And of course, because, they do have these protractable claws, they're very good climbers. Excuse me, I said retractable claws. So they can certainly use those in trees. Okay, so let's look at some specific examples of canine tracks. So here's one of a mountain lion, okay? So in this case, if we look here again, it's very asymmetrical. If I drew a line down the middle here, we can see we've got a clear leading toe, okay? No nail marks in this one. The palm pad is, you can see the size of this pad compared to the toes. You can easily fit the toes inside here, okay? And this one didn't register as clear, but there's two lobes on the top of this pad up here. And again, there's three down here. You have to use your imagination a little. This track's a little bit blown out, but you can see that still. Again, I spoke at it just a minute ago. Toe 3 goes well above the rest of the track on the front track. And the front track is, again, wider, and it's more asymmetrical than the hind track's going to be. And I don't have a picture of a hind track here, but if I did, these two toes would be more roughly equidistant on the top here. You wouldn't have this asymmetry, okay? And the bottom toe, the outer toes would be kind of more in line and lower down. And so it's just a narrower track. The palm pad would be not as wide as well, okay? We can see here there's not as much negative space as in other tracks because this palm pad really registered deep, but we can still see a clear C shape. And you can see here, you just can't draw an X through this track, okay? And so, but we do have a clear rounded C shape, or if you want to say a parabola, but that's, again, is a clear feature of a feline. I talked about the pad can fit all of the toes inside of it. And again, their preferred gait is going to be a walk. So now let's look at a bobcat track, okay? So a bobcat track is going to have basically 4 toes again as well. They're going to be oval shaped, and oftentimes, again, you'll see this very teardrop looking shape in their tracks, okay? And again, it's going to be asymmetrical. This is a front here. It's not as asymmetrical as the mountain lion in that previous one. That was extreme. But again, if I draw a line down here, I see this leading toe, which is right here, okay? And just the rest of the track is not nearly as symmetrical as you would find in canines. The hind track is going to be narrower, again, and more symmetrical. So these toes would be even more roughly in line. And it's just going to be, it's not going to be as tilted or shifted. These toes on the these outer toes are going to be a little narrower in, maybe a little lower down, and a little bit more negative space that you're going to see here. Okay. Again, it's a very large palm pad relative to the toes, so I could fit all 4 of these toes inside this pad. Okay. The inner toes in the hind track, I just kind of mentioned this earlier about more negative space. They're going to be farther up on the track, okay, than this front track is. So that gives this appearance of a greater distance between the palm pad and the inner toes. Okay. Again, we're going to have the same sort of trapezoidal shape here in the palm pad, okay, and we'll be bilobed on the top. However, in bobcats, you don't get really this trilobe shape on the bottom. You kind of get sort of a bilobe on the outside, on both outsides of the palm pad, but then more of a straight line across in the middle. So if typically mountain lions are going to be a much bigger track unless you find a very young one than you do a bobcat. But that's a good feature if you have a good track to distinguish between the two. If size happens to be, let's say you have a very large male bobcat and a smaller feline, a smaller female mountain lion. Okay, I spoke about the C shape again, and you have that clearly here again. Very easy to draw that across here. Okay. And interesting enough, for bobcats, they have these, if you've ever seen one, they kind of have their rear end sort of up in the air. They've got these long hind legs. So when their legs land, the hind track typically lands in front of the front track if they're doing a walk. If they're doing another elope or a gallop, that's not going to be the case. It's going to be a different relationship between the tracks. But when they're walking, you'll see that. That's their most common gait. Okay, and finally, let's look at a house cat here, okay? So this is a track here that, again, it has a lot of feline characteristics like all the other tracks, but some key differences. And first of all, the toes are going to be more oval rather than teardrop shape. So again, probably not quite as round maybe as a gray fox, but you can see why without nails registering, why it's easy to confuse between the two, because they are these more rounded, more oval type of toes, right? With no nail marks showing. And it's going to be asymmetrical, but oftentimes not nearly as much as other felines. So again, if I drew a line down the middle here, we can see a leading toe here at the top, but not as much differentiation, and just the overall track just is not as asymmetrical as in other feline species, okay? The other key difference, and this is the one that I always kind of come to when I'm first seeing this, because you can get a lot of larger house cats that look very similar to bobcats. This one does not, but you can. It can be very tricky to tell the difference at times. So one of the key things is that in the front track, these outer toes are going to be, and even sometimes in the hind tracks, but particularly in the front, the outer toes in a domestic cat are going to be higher up. They're not nearly as low down as situated. And you can see here, because of that, you don't have as much negative space. Another way of thinking about that is that the palm pad and the outer toes are kind of pushed up more towards the inner toes. Okay, and so they're not quite in a line across the top here, but much more so than other feline species. In the hind track, the inner toes are going to be lower than in the front track. Okay, and so excuse me, the inner toes are going to be lower, and so again, there's not a whole lot of differentiation between the front and hind in a domestic cat, whereas in a wild feline, you get a big difference. These outer toes are much lower down. Okay, so that's almost always a clear giveaway. Again, I spoke about the less negative space, particularly in the hind track. You get very little negative space. And in the front track, the outer toes are really spread out wide here. In fact, you can sort of see this. This toe here is literally just about outside the palm pad. This one, not quite as much, but about half of this toe is outside of it. So again, that's a differentiating feature, okay? Again, we get in the palm pad or the metacarpal pad, we get this trapezoidal bilobate, 2 lobes on the top, okay? But it's not as distinct as in other wild feline species, okay? And also, because the toes are more rounded and not as teardrop, not as tapered, from an area standpoint, they occupy more area, and you can't as easily fit, if you just use your imagination, fit all 4 of these toes inside this palm pad. Okay, so again, the toes relative area-wise and size to the palm pad is greater than in other felines. And another interesting thing is that the hind track occasionally in domestic cats can be larger than the front track, and this can be confusing sometimes to tell them apart. So in wild felines, you can almost always tell the front track because it's just bigger, it's wider, you have that leading toe. Much more confusing in domestic cat tracks. Okay, and their preferred gait is an overstep walk. Which again, we kind of talked about that earlier. That's why it's very easy to confuse them with other species, okay? And in this case, you know, it can be very easy to confuse them with a gray fox, okay? So, you know, again, if we think about it, we have round toes, we have no nail marks showing, okay? The toes relative to the palm pad, the size are not, is larger, okay? And so because of that, and then you see an overstep walk, it's very easy to confuse the two. And I have actually a really good example of this. Just recently, I was out on my property, and I knew there were some feral cats running around. I saw some tracks, and I look at it, and I had actually a gray fox in the neighborhood, and I saw his tracks, and I went through, you know, all of this I just telling you, I was like, that's a gray fox. And I went over, and I was certain of it just because I went through the morphology. I moved just a few feet over, and I saw some scat from a gray fox, very different from cat scat. Then I came back, I was looking, and I saw another track almost right next to the first gray fox track. I looked at it, you know, went through this analysis again, and it was like just clear it was a domestic cat. But, you know, in my mind, I'm kind of going, well, you know, I'm like, no, I'm sure this is domestic cat. And then I looked around just a few feet over was a cat scrape. And if you've had a cat or you're familiar with them, you know, they defecate and then they oftentimes cover it with leaves and brush. And I moved that, and sure enough, there was cat scat underneath it. So it was like it was an amazing example of having both of these right next to each other. But when you learn this, you can actually learn with confidence to distinguish between the two. Okay, so I hope this was very interesting for you. You know, this will give you a lot of information to go out, and obviously canine tracks and feline tracks are really fun, and they're some of the most common. But if you want to continue going on for this, then I would encourage you to, you know, sign up for my wildlife tracking course. Okay, this was just part of a couple of modules in the whole course. Okay, and I'm going to put the URL here in the chat if you're interested in it. Let me get this out here. So, excuse me 1 second. Stop sharing for just a second. There you go. So everyone should have that now. You can see it here, obviously. This is a great course because you're going to get the tracks and sign of over 60 different species. Okay. There's no other course like this out there. There's some great field guides, but I can tell you from personal experience, it takes a long time to learn tracking from field guides. And even if you read all the information, you just don't have someone working it through with you, talking it through with you, comparing it to this directly. And so again, Mark Elbrock's book is fantastic, but it's much harder to learn tracking that way. It's a great supplemental field guide to have with you. But this is a fantastic way to learn tracks of many different species. And in the course, there's over 15 modules in it, okay? So it breaks down, and I'll show you that in just a second. And there's over 12 hours of video lessons in there, okay? So this is the same material that I teach at the universities I just mentioned, okay? And if you're worried about, hey, I'm not an academic, I wasn't a biology major, it's okay, okay? It's not, this isn't, you know, really intense science. It's very scientifically sound. And, you know, because we are dealing with anatomy and features of the foot and animal behavior, but it's very digestible material. So there's a lot of information in there. In addition, with the video lessons, you also get these supplemental learning materials. Okay, so you get quizzes, You get analysis exercises and flashcard examples, okay, which just reinforces. So you can go through each module, you can watch the information on the lectures, okay, and there's usually about 45 minutes or so in each module. Then you can go and do the learning exercises, take the quiz, and then practice the flashcards, and it just reinforces it, and you can go back and do it as many times as you want to because you have access for life on this, okay? So that's one thing, 2 years later, 3 years later, you're out, you do a trip somewhere, you can go and reference this. In fact, you can even reference it on your phone, okay? So it's mobile friendly. You also get access to my Naturalist Speak member community, so you can post your own tracking images, talk to other members, ask questions. And actually, if you sign up for this, okay, you'll get help from me for a whole year in identifying any types of animal tracks or sign that you find. So if you find something that really stumps you, you can send a photo, post it on the community, and I'll do my best to answer it. Obviously, sometimes it can be tricky with a photo, but I'll help you through that, okay? The deadline to enroll for this is tonight, okay? And there's a reason for that, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you want to sign up for this, it's a great value right now. Then do so tonight by midnight. Okay, I think it's midnight Pacific time. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, you're going to get these video lessons on all these different topics. Okay, covering all kinds of not only tracks but other animal signs. So their scat, feeding sign, denning behavior, how to age sign, analyzing gaits. That's one of the key aspects of the course. How to trail animals. You're going to learn how to trail animals so that you can actually track an animal, and depending on where you live and where you are, you can actually find that animal. So you're going to get strategies to do all of that, okay? Also, it doesn't just cover a few of the big mammals. Obviously, we started with some of those tonight, and you saw canines and feline tracks. There's also other species I didn't even include tonight, some other felines, which are found in North America. Okay, but many other species. So deer, bears, medium-sized mammals, rodents, even birds as well, going into reptiles and amphibians. It's incredibly comprehensive, okay? So you're going to get out of this really the ability to track virtually any animal in North America, maybe save some really small insects and what have you, but you're going to have the basics of all the major animal groups, which will prepare you very well for a cyber tracker evaluation, okay, if you decide to do that. Also, I mentioned the quizzes, so you can go in here, and again, that just kind of reinforces the learning material. Okay, basically, if I cover something in a lecture and says, hey, feline tracks are, asymmetrical or symmetrical, or, canine tracks, maybe true and false, multiple choice, but that just really helps to reinforce the learning material, as well as for every one of these modules, you're going to get an analysis exercise, and it has several photos of tracks or sign, which basically says, okay, look at this, you get a chance to do your analysis first, to go in and look at that track or piece of animal sign. And then I do what's called this primary perception, secondary perception. It's a very scientifically sound method to go through, basically identify all the features first that you see. And then once you do that, then you basically go in and you do an analysis. Okay, based on this, what does this most likely correlate with? What species? And so I give you examples of that. Again, it's a great learning tool. And then you also get these flashcards, okay? So this is a great way of showing you a track, and saying, hey, what is this? You click on it, and it tells you right or wrong. And there's dozens of these for each module. So again, it's just another way of practicing and reinforcing. You can revisit this again as many times as you want. This is all included in the course. And then finally, I want to throw in one other thing, because, and this is why I sent this to you today, and to let you know that if you join today, okay, the live course is currently running. So there's been, I'm running a live course right now. I'm actually about to teach another session this evening. It starts in just a few minutes. Going to go over some of this same material tonight, but in more depth. But there's 6 more weeks. But even if you miss the first 1 or 2, they're all recorded. Okay, so you're going to have access to all of that, all of these live 8 sessions if you book today. by midnight. So if this is something that appeals to you, by all means sign up. Would love to have you in there. Again, everything is on demand, even the live sessions after. You can go back and watch them, and you have lifetime access. And again, you get to actually ask me questions for a year. If you find tracks or sign in the field, you can send me a photo, and I'll do my best to try to answer it for you. So anyway, I really have enjoyed having you guys. I'm going to send a recording out to this to everyone because I know there was confusion on the time. So if you just jumped in now and you kind of missed it, no worries. My apologies for that. You'll get to watch the whole thing. Okay. So you'll be able to digest all of this information. Okay. So you're going to get to see all of this. And I really appreciate everyone joining, and hope to see you again out there. So thank you very much for your time. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Have a good day.